The flames had already consumed half the barn when Clara Thompson burst through the wooden doors, her wedding dress smoking at the hem, and collided directly into the chest of a man who smelled like leather and sage. Frank Bennett had been racing toward the inferno, drawn by the screams and the orange glow that lit up the Arizona night sky like a second sunset. But he had not expected to catch an armful of terrified women dressed in cream-colored silk that was rapidly turning black with soot. She coughed violently against his shirt, her whole body shaking, and he wrapped his arms around her instinctively, pulling her away from the building as the roof began to groan and splinter. Behind them, the barn let out a sound like a dying animal, timber cracking and collapsing inward, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness like angry fireflies. "I have got you," Frank said, his voice steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "You are safe now." Clara could not speak yet, could only grip the front of his shirt with fingers that had gone white at the knuckles. Her lungs burned, her eyes watered, and every breath tasted like ash and fear. She had thought she was going to die in that barn, trapped by flames that had erupted so suddenly she had barely understood what was happening before the smoke was choking her. One moment she had been standing at the makeshift altar, about to marry a man she had never met in person, and the next, the world had turned to heat and panic. Frank half carried, half guided her further from the blaze, past the cluster of people who had formed a desperate bucket brigade from the well, though everyone could see it was far too late to save the structure. He brought her to the water trough near the corral and helped her sit on the edge, then dipped his bandana into the cool water and pressed it gently to her face. The gesture was so tender, so unexpectedly kind, that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes that had nothing to do with the smoke. "Breathe slow," he instructed, crouching before her so their eyes were level. His were a startling shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the desert, and they searched her face with genuine concern. "In through your nose if you can, out through your mouth." She tried to follow his direction, though each breath still felt ragged and insufficient. Up close, even through her watering eyes, she could see he was perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that fell across his forehead. There was a scar along his jawline, thin and white with age, and his hands on her face were calloused but remarkably gentle. The others, Clara managed to gasp out. Were there others inside? No one else, Frank assured her quickly. The guests were all outside when it started. You were the only one who did not make it out right away. Relief flooded through her, so intense it left her dizzy. She had heard screaming, had been certain that someone else was trapped, but perhaps it had only been the sound of her own voice, distorted by the roar of the flames. She looked past Frank's shoulder at the barn, which was now fully engulfed, collapsing in on itself in a spectacular display of destruction. Her wedding, her future. Everything she had traveled 2,000 miles to claim, gone in a matter of minutes. "My husband," she said suddenly, trying to stand. "Where is Henry? Is he hurt?" Frank's expression darkened slightly, but he kept his hands steady on her shoulders, keeping her seated. "Henry Colton is fine. He is over there, talking to the sheriff." Clara followed his gaze and saw a knot of men standing near the road, their faces illuminated by the firelight. She recognized Henry immediately, even though she had only met him in person 3 hours ago. He was a tall man with thinning brown hair and narrow shoulders, dressed in his best suit, and he was gesturing animatedly as he spoke. Even from this distance, she could see he looked more angry than concerned. "I should go to him," Clara said, though she made no move to rise. Something about Frank's presence felt like an anchor, solid and safe in a night that had turned chaotic. "You should stay here and catch your breath," Frank countered. "You nearly died. A few more minutes will not hurt anyone." He was right, of course. Her legs felt like water, and the world still had a strange, tilted quality to it, as though she were viewing everything through warped glass. She took the damp bandana from Frank's hand and held it to her face, breathing in the smell of clean water and cotton. Around them, the sounds of the dying fire filled the night, crackling wood, shouting voices, the nervous whinnying of horses being led to safety. "Thank you," Clara said finally, lowering the cloth to meet Frank's eyes again. "You saved my life." I just happened to be in the right place, Frank replied, but there was a faint color rising in his cheeks that suggested her gratitude affected him. Anyone would have done the same, but you did it, Clara insisted. What is your name, Frank Bennett? I work the cattle ranch about 5 miles west of here. I was invited to the wedding because Henry and I do business sometimes. I am Clara Thompson, she said, then paused. Or I suppose I am still Clara Thompson. The ceremony never finished. An awkward silence fell between them at that, both of them acutely aware of the strangeness of the situation. Clara had come to Tombstone, Arizona as a mail-order bride, responding to Henry Colton's advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper. She had exchanged letters with him for 6 months, carefully constructing an image of him from his words kind, hardworking, looking for a good woman to help him build a life. In person, Henry had been polite but distant, and Clara had felt a creeping unease from the moment he had met her at the stage-coach station. Still, she had come all this way, had burned all her bridges in Philadelphia, had nowhere else to go. The wedding was supposed to be her new beginning. Now, looking at the smoldering ruins of the barn where that wedding was to have taken place, Clara felt unmoored, uncertain of what came next. Clara. A sharp voice cut through her thoughts, and she looked up to see Henry striding toward them, his face flushed and his eyes hard. There you are. I have been looking everywhere for you. Frank stood smoothly, putting himself slightly between Clara and Henry in a way that might have been accidental but felt deliberate. She nearly died in that fire, he said evenly. She needs a doctor to look at her. I can see she is fine, Henry snapped, barely glancing at Clara. The sheriff wants to ask her some questions about how the fire started. Clara felt Frank stiffen beside her. Are you suggesting she had something to do with it? I am not suggesting anything. But she was the last one in the barn, and the fire started right where she was standing. Henry's tone was cold, businesslike, as though he were discussing a broken fence or a lame horse rather than the woman he had been about to marry. That is ridiculous, Frank said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. She was the one who nearly died. If she had started the fire, why would she have stayed inside? I do not know. Maybe she panicked. Maybe it was an accident. Henry finally looked at Clara directly, and she saw suspicion in his eyes that made her stomach turn. Either way, the barn is gone, along with everything I had stored in it. That is $300 worth of equipment and supplies, not to mention the structure itself. Clara found her voice, though it came out rough and strained. I had nothing to do with the fire. One moment we were standing there, and the next, flames just erupted from the hay bales near the back. It happened so fast. Convenient, Henry muttered. Watch yourself, Frank warned, and there was no mistaking the threat in his tone now. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, and Clara had the sudden, vivid impression of two wolves circling, testing for weakness. Then the sheriff, a portly man with a magnificent mustache, hurried over and inserted himself between them. Now, gentlemen, no need for trouble. Henry, I have already told you, it looks like the fire started from a knocked-over lantern in the hay. Pure accident, these things happen. He turned to Clara with a much gentler expression. Miss Thompson, are you all right? That must have been terrifying. I am fine, thank you, Clara managed, though she was still trembling. Good. Well, I think the best thing is for everyone to go home and get some rest. Nothing more can be done here tonight. The sheriff clapped Henry on the shoulder. Sorry about your barn, Henry. Insurance should cover some of it. Henry's jaw worked silently for a moment, and Clara could see him struggling to contain his anger. Finally, he nodded curtly. Clara, get your things. We are leaving. Where are her things? Frank asked. At my house, where she was supposed to be going as my wife after the ceremony. Henry's emphasis on the last word was pointed. Clara felt trapped suddenly, caught between two men she barely knew in a town that was still unfamiliar with no clear path forward. She was not married to Henry, but she had nowhere else to go. All her possessions were indeed at his house, brought there earlier in the day by Henry's housekeeper. She had no money for a hotel, no friends or family within 2,000 miles. I will take you, Frank said quietly, speaking only to Clara, to wherever you need to go. She is going with me, Henry interjected. She may not be my wife yet, but we had an agreement. Agreements can be changed, Frank said. The sheriff held up both hands. Gentlemen, please, Miss Thompson can make her own decisions. She is not property to be fought over. He looked at Clara. What would you like to do, miss? All eyes turned to her, and Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. She looked at Henry, who stood rigid with barely contained frustration, his eyes still holding that edge of suspicion and resentment. Then she looked at Frank, who watched her with those storm cloud eyes, his expression open and concerned, waiting for her decision without trying to force it. I need my belongings, Clara said carefully. If Mr. Colton will permit me to stay at his home tonight in a separate room, I would appreciate it. Tomorrow, when my head is clearer, we can discuss what happens next. It was a diplomatic answer, and she could see Frank did not like it, but he nodded acceptance. Henry looked somewhat mollified, though his expression remained sour. Fine, Henry said. My housekeeper will prepare the spare room, but we will talk in the morning about salvaging this arrangement. I did not pay for your train ticket and wait 6 months just to have you back out because of a little fire. The words stung, partly because of their callousness and partly because Clara knew he was right about one thing. She had entered into an agreement, and she had no easy way to extricate herself from it. She had sold everything she owned in Philadelphia to make this journey, fleeing a city where she had no prospects and too many painful memories. Going back was not an option. Frank reached out and took her hand briefly, squeezing it in a gesture of support that felt shockingly intimate given they had met less than an hour ago. If you need anything at all, my ranch is 5 miles west on the main road, Bennett Ranch. Anyone in town can tell you how to find it. Thank you, Clara whispered, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Henry made an impatient sound and turned on his heel, clearly expecting Clara to follow. She did, though she looked back once at Frank, who stood watching her go with his hands shoved in his pockets and an unreadable expression on his face. The firelight cast wild shadows across his features, making him look almost dangerous, and Clara felt something shift in her chest, some recognition she could not name. The walk to Henry's house took 15 minutes, and he did not speak a single word to her the entire way. His home turned out to be a modest wooden structure on the edge of town, with a small porch and shuttered windows. Inside, it was clean but sparse, furnished with the bare necessities and nothing more. The housekeeper, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Garrett, showed Clara to the spare room without comment, though her eyes were sharp and assessing. Left alone, Clara sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked down at herself. Her wedding dress was ruined, stained with soot and torn at the hem. Her hands were shaking again, the adrenaline that had carried her through the last hour finally draining away, leaving her hollow and exhausted. She thought about the fire, about those terrifying moments when she had been certain she would not escape, when the smoke had been so thick she could not see the door. She thought about Frank's arms around her, steady and strong, and his voice telling her she was safe. She barely knew him. She had no right to feel anything about him at all, and yet, Clara lay back on the bed without bothering to undress and stared at the ceiling, wondering what on earth she was going to do. Sleep did not come for a long time, and when it did, she dreamed of fire and gray-blue eyes. Morning arrived with harsh sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. Clara woke disoriented, her throat raw and her head aching, and for a confused moment she could not remember where she was. Then it all came back in a rush: the fire, Frank, Henry's cold suspicion. She groaned and sat up, running her hands through her tangled hair. Someone had left a basin of water and a clean towel on the dresser, and Clara used them gratefully, scrubbing away the worst of the soot from her face and hands. She had no clean clothes except what was in her trunk, which she found tucked in the corner of the room. She pulled out a simple blue cotton dress and changed into it, leaving the ruined wedding gown in a heap on the floor. Downstairs, she found Henry and Mrs. Garrett at the kitchen table, eating breakfast in silence. Henry looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Sit," he said, gesturing to an empty chair. "We need to talk." Clara sat, and Mrs. Garrett wordlessly placed a plate of eggs and bacon in front of her, along with a cup of coffee. She was not particularly hungry, but she ate anyway, needing something to do with her hands. I have been thinking about our situation, Henry began without preamble. The fire was unfortunate, but it does not change the basic facts. You came here to marry me, and I still need a wife. The way I see it, we can proceed with a simple ceremony at the courthouse this afternoon, and we can move forward as planned. Clara set down her fork carefully. Henry, I nearly died last night, and your first concern was about your barn and your equipment. You barely asked if I was all right. You are clearly all right, Henry said impatiently. I can see that with my own eyes. What good would it have done to stand around wringing my hands? I am a practical man, Clara. That is what I told you in my letters. I need a practical wife. Practical is one thing, compassionate is another. Henry's expression hardened. I suppose Frank Bennett was compassionate enough for you. The accusation hung in the air between them, ugly and pointed. Clara felt her temper flare, the first real anger cutting through her exhaustion and confusion. He pulled me out of a burning building and made sure I was not injured. Yes, he was compassionate. That is what decent people do. Decent people do not make eyes at other men's intended brides. We are not married, Henry. The ceremony never happened, and I have not made eyes at anyone. Even as she said it, Clara knew it was not entirely true, and the guilt must have shown on her face because Henry's expression turned triumphant. I knew it. You met him for 5 minutes, and you are already imagining yourself on his ranch instead of here with me. That is not fair. What is not fair is that I invested time and money into bringing you here, and now you want to back out because some cowboy played hero. Henry leaned forward, his voice dropping. Let me make something clear, Clara. You have no money, no family here, and nowhere to go. You need me, whether you want to admit it or not. So you can marry me this afternoon and have a home and security, or you can chase after Frank Bennett and see where that gets you. Which do you think is the smarter choice? He was right, and they both knew it. Clara had arrived in Tombstone with less than $10 to her name and no prospects beyond becoming Henry's wife. She could not afford a return ticket to Philadelphia, even if she wanted to go back, which she did not. The life she had left behind had been one of genteel poverty, living with a distant cousin who resented her presence and made sure Clara knew she was a burden. The promise of a fresh start, of a home of her own, had been irresistible. But sitting across from Henry now, seeing the calculating coldness in his eyes, Clara felt a deep sense of wrongness settle in her bones. This man did not love her. He might not even like her very much. He wanted a wife the way he might want a new plow or a sturdy horse, something useful to help him run his household and his business. There would be no warmth, no partnership, no joy. I need time to think, Clara said finally. You have until this afternoon, Henry replied. After that, I am withdrawing my offer. I will not sit around waiting while you daydream about other options. Clara pushed back from the table, her breakfast barely touched. Then I suppose I have some thinking to do. She left the kitchen and walked out onto the porch, breathing in the morning air. Tombstone was coming to life around her shopkeepers, opening their doors, horses and wagons moving along the main street, the sound of hammering from somewhere nearby. It was a rough town, still young and finding its footing, but there was an energy to it that Clara found appealing, or she would have under different circumstances. You all right, dear? Mrs. Garrett had followed her outside, wiping her hands on her apron. Up close, the housekeeper's stern face softened slightly into something more sympathetic. Honestly, I do not know, Clara admitted. Henry is not a bad man, Mrs. Garrett said carefully, but he is not an easy one either. His first wife died 3 years ago, fever took her, and he has not been the same since. I think he loved her very much, though he never showed it much even then. Now he just wants things to run smooth and efficient like a business. That is no way to live a marriage. No, it is not, Mrs. Garrett agreed, but it is what he is offering. You should know that before you decide. Clara nodded slowly. Thank you for your honesty. For what it is worth, that Bennett boy has a good reputation. His father built that ranch from nothing, and Frank has kept it running well since the old man passed. He is fair with his workers, pays his debts, and I have never heard a bad word about his character. Mrs. Garrett gave Clara a shrewd look. Of course, a good reputation does not put food on the table if you have got no formal arrangement with him. I know, Clara said softly. Mrs. Garrett patted her shoulder and went back inside, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. She stood on the porch for a long time, watching the town go about its business, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions and practical concerns warring in her head. The sun climbed higher, the morning heat building, and still she had no clear answer. She was still standing there when a familiar figure on horseback rode up the street and stopped in front of the house. Frank swung down from his saddle with easy grace and tied his horse to the post, then looked up at Clara with that same open, concerned expression he had worn the night before. "Morning," he said, removing his hat. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were all right." "That is kind of you," Clara replied, and she found herself smiling despite everything. There was something about Frank's presence that made her feel lighter, less trapped. "How are you feeling?" "Any trouble breathing? My throat is sore, but otherwise I am fine." She hesitated, then added, "Henry wants to marry me this afternoon at the courthouse." Frank's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, something that looked like disappointment mixed with resignation. "Is that what you want?" "I do not know what I want," Clara said honestly. "I came here for a fresh start, for a chance at a better life. Henry offered that in his letters, but the reality is not what I expected." "It rarely is," Frank said quietly. He climbed the steps to stand beside her on the porch, close enough that she could smell leather and horses and something uniquely him. "Can I be honest with you, Clara? Please. I have not been able to stop thinking about you since last night. I know that is forward of me to say, and I know you have got an arrangement with Henry, and I have got no right to interfere. But if you marry him this afternoon, I will always wonder what might have happened if I had just said something." He turned to face her fully, his gray-blue eyes intense. "I am not a rich man. My ranch does well enough, but it is hard work and long days. I cannot offer you an easy life, but I can offer you honesty and respect, and I think, given time, maybe something more." Clara's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you are brave because you did not panic in that fire. I know you are kind because your first thought when you got out was whether anyone else was hurt. I know you are smart because you are not just jumping into a marriage that does not feel right, even though it would be the easy choice." He took a small step closer. "And I know that, when I held you last night, it felt more right than anything has felt in a very long time." "Frank," Clara breathed, and she did not know if it was a protest or a plea. "I am not asking you to decide right now," Frank said. "I am just asking you to give me a chance. Come out to the ranch, see what I can offer you, and then make your choice. If you still want to marry Henry after that, I will step aside and never bother you again, but at least you will know all your options." It was madness. Clara had known this man for less than a day. She should have been telling him no, should have been gently but firmly sending him away and proceeding with the practical, sensible plan to marry Henry. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But when she looked at Frank, at the hope and vulnerability in his face, she did not feel smart or safe. She felt alive in a way she had not felt in years, maybe ever. She felt like something important was happening, like the universe was offering her a choice that mattered. "All right," Clara said and watched his face light up. "I will come see your ranch, but I need to tell Henry first." "Of course," Frank agreed quickly. "I will wait here." Clara went back inside, her heart racing, and found Henry in his study going over ledgers. He looked up when she entered, his expression expectant. "I have made my decision," Clara said, standing straight and meeting his gaze directly. "I am not going to marry you, Henry. I am sorry for the inconvenience and for any expense you incurred, but I cannot commit to a marriage without respect and affection." Henry's face flushed dark red. "This is about Frank Bennett. This is about me," Clara corrected. "About what kind of life I want to live. You deserve someone who can be practical and efficient for you, someone who will not expect warmth or romance. But that is not me." "You are making a mistake," Henry said coldly. "You will regret this." "Maybe," Clara acknowledged, "but it will be my mistake to make." She turned and walked out before he could say anything else, before her courage could fail. She collected her trunk from the spare room, managing to drag it down the stairs through sheer determination, and emerged onto the porch where Frank was waiting. He took the trunk from her immediately, lifting it with ease. "Ready?" he asked. I am terrified, Clara admitted. But yes, I am ready. Frank secured her trunk to his horse, then helped Clara up into the saddle before mounting behind her. His arms came around her to hold the reins solid and warm, and Clara let herself lean back against his chest just a little. He made a clicking sound to the horse, and they started down the street at an easy walk. People stared as they passed, and Clara knew the gossip would be all over town by evening. The mail-order bride who had abandoned Henry Colton for Frank Bennett within 24 hours of arriving. She should have been mortified, should have been worried about her reputation. Instead, she felt something very much like relief. The ride out to Bennett Ranch took nearly an hour, and Frank kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the area. He spoke about his cattle, about the seasonal rhythms of ranch work, about his plans for expanding the herd. He spoke about his father, who had died 4 years ago, and his mother, who had passed when he was young. He spoke about the challenges of running a ranch alone, about how much help it required, and how hard it was to find good, reliable workers. Clara listened, asking questions, and gradually the tight knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen. Frank spoke to her like an equal, like her opinions mattered, and there was none of the calculating assessment that had characterized every interaction with Henry. This felt like the beginning of a genuine friendship, and underneath that something else, something warm and promising. Bennett Ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, a sprawling collection of buildings centered around a sturdy ranch house, with corrals and barns spreading out in organized clusters. It was not elegant, but it was well maintained, and Clara could see evidence of prosperity in the healthy-looking cattle grazing in the near pastures and the good repair of the structures. "It is not much," Frank said, sounding suddenly nervous, "but it is home." "It looks wonderful," Clara said honestly. He helped her down from the horse, his hands lingering at her waist just a moment longer than necessary, and then showed her inside. The house was spacious, with a large central room that served as kitchen and living area, 2 bedrooms off to the sides, and a loft space above. It was furnished simply but comfortably, with sturdy furniture and colorful woven rugs on the floor. Everything was clean, if a bit dusty, and Clara could see the bones of a real home here. "I know it needs a woman's touch," Frank said, watching her look around. "I do my best, but I am not much for decoration or fussy details." "It has good bones," Clara said. "That is what matters." Frank showed her the rest of the house, including the spare bedroom, which he was careful to point out. "You would stay here if you decided to give this a real chance. I would not expect anything from you, Clara, not until we both felt ready, not until it was right." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the respect it showed, made Clara's throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she managed. They spent the rest of the day together, and Frank showed her around the ranch, introducing her to his 3 ranch hands, a grizzled older man named Pete, and 2 younger men, brothers named Sam and Jake. All 3 tipped their hats to her respectfully, and she caught Pete giving Frank an approving nod when he thought they were not looking. Frank showed her the cattle, the vegetable garden that was struggling from neglect, the chicken coop that needed repairs. He was honest about the work, about the early mornings and the long days, about the way droughts and disease and market prices could make or break a season. But he was also clearly proud of what he had built, and Clara found his enthusiasm infectious. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they sat on the porch of the ranch house and Frank made them coffee in a battered pot. They drank in companionable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Can I ask you something?" Frank said eventually, "Of course." "Why did you come west? What were you running from?" Clara considered deflecting, then decided he deserved honesty. "I was not running so much as escaping. My parents died when I was 19, and I had to go live with my mother's cousin in Philadelphia. She took me in out of duty, not love, and she made sure I knew it every day. I tried to find work, but there was not much available for a woman with no special skills. I was being courted by a man who was twice my age and had already buried 2 wives, and my cousin was pressuring me to accept his proposal because she wanted me out of her house." Clara took a sip of coffee. "When I saw Henry's advertisement, it felt like a lifeline. A chance to start over, to build something of my own. I am sorry, Frank said quietly. That must have been hard. It was lonely more than anything else, Clara admitted. I felt like I did not matter to anyone, like I was just taking up space in the world. Frank set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. You matter, Clara. I have known you less than a day, and I can already tell you that you matter a great deal. The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. How can you possibly know that? Because of the way you have looked at everything today. Not with judgment, but with possibility. Because you ask thoughtful questions and you listen to the answers. Because you laugh at my bad jokes and you are not afraid to tell me when you disagree with something I have said. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. Because when I look at you, I see someone worth knowing, worth cherishing. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. No one had ever spoken to her like that, had ever made her feel seen in quite that way. Frank, I do not want to rush into anything. I just walked away from one near marriage. I need time to be sure. I know, Frank said, and I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I am just asking you to stay, to give us a chance to see what this could be. You can have the spare room for as long as you need it. No pressure, no expectations. Just time to figure out if this feels right to you too. It was more than Clara had dared to hope for. A place to stay, a chance to breathe and think, and the company of a man who made her feel safe and valued. All right, she said. I will stay, for a little while at least. Frank's smile was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. That is all I ask. That night, Clara lay in the spare bedroom and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of wood settling, the whisper of wind across the plains. She was acutely aware of Frank in the next room, separated from her by only a thin wall. But instead of feeling uncomfortable or threatened, she felt strangely peaceful. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt like she had made the right choice. The days that followed developed into a rhythm that felt natural and right. Clara woke early, as Frank did, and they would have breakfast together before he headed out to work. She spent her days making improvements to the house, mending curtains, scrubbing floors, organizing the kitchen. She tended the struggling vegetable garden, coaxing life back into neglected plants. She repaired the chicken coop and was rewarded with fresh eggs. She cooked meals that filled the house with good smells, and Frank always thanked her like she had given him something precious. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk. Frank told her stories about growing up on the ranch, about his father's stern but fair guidance, about learning to ride and rope and brand. Clara told him about Philadelphia, about the books she loved to read, about her mother's garden that had been her favorite place as a child. They discovered shared tastes in music and poetry, a mutual love of storms, and a tendency toward stubbornness that made them both laugh. Sometimes Frank would play his guitar, old folk songs and ballads, his voice rough but pleasant. Clara would close her eyes and listen, feeling something warm and sweet unfurl in her chest. Sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence, just being near each other, and that felt perfect too. Pete and the brothers warmed to Clara quickly, especially after she started bringing fresh baked bread and cookies out to them when they were working near the house. They treated her with respectful courtesy, and she heard Pete tell Frank one evening that he had made a good choice, though they both pretended not to see her listening from the kitchen window. 2 weeks after Clara's arrival, Tombstone held a town social, and Frank asked if she would like to go with him. Clara agreed, though she felt nervous about facing the townspeople after the scandal of abandoning Henry. Frank seemed to sense her anxiety and squeezed her hand as they rode into town. The social was held in the church hall, with tables laden with food and a small group of musicians providing entertainment. Clara felt the stares as she and Frank entered, saw the whispers behind raised hands, but Frank kept his arm firmly around her waist and introduced her to people with quiet pride. Gradually, the stares became less hostile and more curious, and a few of the braver women approached to welcome her. I heard you were staying out at Bennett Ranch, one woman said, a pretty brunette named Sarah who ran the general store with her husband. How are you finding it? It is lovely, Clara said honestly, quite different from Philadelphia, but in a good way. Frank is a good man, Sarah said, lowering her voice. Better than some I could mention, you made the right choice. The validation from a stranger who owed her nothing made Clara feel infinitely better. As the evening progressed, she relaxed, even agreeing to dance with Frank when the music turned lively. He was not a particularly skilled dancer, but he was enthusiastic, and he made her laugh when he fumbled the steps. They whirled around the floor and Clara felt eyes on them, but for once she did not care. Let them talk. Let them gossip. This felt right in a way nothing else had. They were taking a break, drinking punch and catching their breath when Henry appeared at Clara's elbow. She had not seen him arrive, and his sudden presence made her tense. "Clara," Henry said, his tone neutral. "Frank?" "Henry," Frank replied, equally neutral, but Clara felt him shift slightly closer to her. "I wanted to apologize," Henry said, and he seemed to mean it. "For the things I said when you left. You were right. I was thinking more about my barn than about your well-being, and that was wrong of me." Clara blinked in surprise. "Thank you, I appreciate that. I also wanted to say that I have found someone else. Another woman from Tucson. We have been corresponding, and she will be arriving next month." Henry glanced between them. "I hope there are no hard feelings." "None at all," Clara said, meaning it. "I hope you will be very happy together." Henry nodded, looking relieved, and moved away into the crowd. Frank let out a breath and grinned at Clara. "Well, that went better than expected." "Much better," Clara agreed, feeling another weight lift from her shoulders. As the weeks turned into months, Clara found herself settling into life at the ranch in ways she had never imagined possible. The work was hard, but it was satisfying, and she loved seeing the tangible results of her efforts, the garden flourishing, the house clean and comfortable, the meals that brought genuine pleasure to Frank and the ranch hands. She learned to ride, with Frank as her patient teacher, and discovered she had a natural affinity for it. She learned to handle the chickens and even helped with the cattle when extra hands were needed. But more than the work, it was her deepening connection with Frank that made each day feel full and meaningful. He was everything Henry had not been: warm, attentive, genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. He made her laugh with his dry humor and touched her with his unexpected moments of tenderness. He brought her wildflowers he found on his rides and listened with genuine interest when she talked about the books she had brought with her from Philadelphia. Slowly, carefully, they grew closer. A touch on the hand became holding hands. Sitting near each other became sitting with her head on his shoulder. Good night wishes became lingering at bedroom doors, neither quite willing to part. The attraction between them was undeniable, but Frank never pushed, never demanded. He let Clara set the pace, and she loved him for it. 4 months after arriving at Bennett Ranch on a warm evening in late summer, Clara finally admitted to herself what she had known for weeks: she was in love with Frank Bennett. Completely, irrevocably in love. The realization did not frighten her as she thought it might. Instead, it felt like coming home. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Clara turned to Frank and said, "I want to marry you." Frank went very still, his eyes searching her face in the dim light. "Are you sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," Clara said. "I love you, Frank. I think I have loved you since the night you pulled me out of that fire, but I needed time to be certain, and now I am." Frank's smile was radiant, and he cupped her face in his hands with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "I love you too, Clara. I have loved you from the moment you looked up at me with soot on your face and fear in your eyes, and you still found the strength to thank me. You are the strongest, kindest, most remarkable woman I have ever known." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Clara melted into him, wrapping her arms around his neck. The kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, and when they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "Marry me tomorrow," Frank said, his forehead pressed against hers. "I do not want to wait another day." "Tomorrow," Clara agreed, laughing breathlessly. "Yes, let us get married tomorrow." They rode into Tombstone at dawn and were married by the Justice of the Peace in a simple ceremony with Pete, Sam, and Jake as witnesses. Clara wore a new blue dress that Sarah from the general store had helped her pick out, and Frank wore his best suit and looked so handsome it made Clara's breath catch. There was no fire this time, no disaster, just quiet joy and the beginning of a life they would build together. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, all the careful restraint of the past months finally released. Frank was gentle with Clara, attentive to her needs and her pleasure, and she discovered that intimacy with someone you truly loved was a revelation. They came together with laughter and sighs, learning each other's bodies and hearts, and afterward lay tangled in each other's arms, talking until dawn. The months that followed were the happiest of Clara's life. She and Frank fell into an easy partnership, working side by side to run the ranch, making decisions together, supporting each other through challenges and celebrating successes. The ranch prospered under their joint management, and they began to make improvements, expanding the herd, building a new barn, hiring additional help. Clara became a fixture in Tombstone society, making friends among the other ranch wives and townswomen. She joined the Ladies' Aid Society and helped organize fundraisers for the new schoolhouse. She wrote long letters to an old friend in Philadelphia, describing her new life in glowing terms, and was gratified when her friend wrote back expressing envy at Clara's happiness. But the greatest joy came a year and a half after their marriage, when Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told Frank over breakfast one morning, simply and directly, and watched his face transform with wonder and delight. "A baby," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Clara confirmed, laughing at his expression. Frank came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was something infinitely precious. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I love you so much, Clara." "I love you too," she whispered back. "So much." The pregnancy was not easy. Clara suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and Frank hovered anxiously, making her tea and fetching whatever food she thought she might be able to keep down. As she grew larger, the summer heat became oppressive, and there were days when she could do little but sit in the shade and try to stay cool. But through it all, Frank was there, supportive and loving, and Clara never once regretted her decision to stay. Their son was born on a crisp October morning, after a long labor that had Frank pacing the floor like a caged animal while the midwife and Sarah attended to Clara. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he burst into the bedroom, his face white with anxiety. "Is she all right?" "Is the baby all right?" "We are both fine," Clara said, exhausted but radiant, holding their son against her chest. "Come meet your son." Frank approached slowly, as if afraid he might break something, and looked down at the tiny, red-faced baby with an expression of such profound love that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "He is perfect," Frank breathed. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas after Frank's father, and he became the center of their world. Frank was a devoted father, rising in the night to help with feedings, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just watching Thomas sleep. Clara would often find them together, Frank talking to Thomas in a low, soothing voice about the ranch and the cattle and all the things he would teach his son when he was older. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic but infinitely richer. Thomas grew from a tiny, helpless infant into a chubby, laughing baby who clearly adored his parents. The ranch continued to prosper, and Frank and Clara began talking about building a larger house, something they could raise a family in. "How many children do you want?" Frank asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching Thomas play with a wooden horse Frank had carved for him. "At least 2 more, Clara said. "I do not want Thomas to be an only child. Siblings are important." "I agree," Frank said, pulling her close. "A house full of children sounds perfect to me." 2 years later, their second son, William, was born, and 2 years after that, their daughter, Grace. The house Frank built to accommodate their growing family was a sprawling 2-story structure with a wide porch and room for everyone. Clara filled it with warmth and laughter, with home-cooked meals and bedtime stories and traditions that became the foundation of their family life. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the ranch and followed his father everywhere. William was more adventurous, always getting into mischief and making everyone laugh. Grace was sweet and curious, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray-blue eyes, and both her parents and brothers were utterly devoted to her. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. First words and first steps, first days at the new schoolhouse, first rides on their own horses. There were challenges too, a particularly brutal winter that killed part of the herd, a drought that tested everyone's resilience, illnesses and injuries, and the inevitable heartaches that came with life. But through it all, Frank and Clara faced everything together, their love deepening with each passing year. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Clara back to the spot where he had first pulled her from the burning barn. The old foundation was still visible, now overgrown with grass and wildflowers, a faint scar on the landscape. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked, holding her hand. "Staying with me instead of marrying Henry?" Clara looked at him in genuine surprise. "Not for a single second." "That fire was the best thing that ever happened to me, Frank. It brought me to you." "I think about that night sometimes," Frank admitted. "How close I came to never knowing you, if I had arrived a minute later, if you had not made it out, if you had decided to marry Henry anyway." He shook his head. "I thank God every day that things worked out the way they did." "I wrapped myself in your arms that night," Clara said softly, "and you wrapped me in your word. You promised me safety and respect and time, and you kept every single promise. You gave me everything I ever wanted and things I did not even know I needed." Frank pulled her close and kissed her, deep and sweet, and Clara felt the same flutter in her stomach that she had felt that first night, that first kiss. Some things never changed, never faded. Some loves only grew stronger with time. They walked back to their home together, hand in hand, and found their children playing in the yard, Thomas teaching William how to rope a fence post, Grace sitting in the grass making chains from dandelions. The ranch sprawled around them, prosperous and well-maintained, a testament to years of hard work and shared dreams. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, just like it had that first evening Clara had spent at the ranch. "This is everything I ever wanted," Clara said, watching her family with tears in her eyes. "This life, this place, you, everything." "Me too," Frank said, his arm around her waist. "Me too." As twilight deepened and the first stars appeared, they called their children inside for dinner. The house glowed with warm light, and laughter spilled out through the open windows. Inside, they would sit around the table Frank had built with his own hands, in the house they had filled with love, and they would share a meal and stories of their day. Later, after the children were in bed, Frank and Clara would sit on the porch as they always did, talking quietly or simply enjoying the peace of the evening. They would watch the stars and listen to the night sounds of the ranch, and they would hold hands like they had held hands that very first evening when everything was new and uncertain and full of possibility. Clara Thompson Bennett had come to Arizona as a mail-order bride, fleeing a burning barn and an uncertain future. She had been caught by a cowboy who wrapped her in his arms and gave her his word, and in doing so, had given her everything she never knew she needed. She had found home in the most unexpected way, in the most unexpected place, with the most extraordinary man. And every single day, she was grateful beyond measure for the fire that had led her to Frank, for the courage to choose love over security, for the life they had built together from nothing but hope and determination, and a love that had started in a moment of crisis and grown into something that would last a lifetime. Years continued to pass in their comfortable rhythm, and the Bennett Ranch became known throughout the region as one of the most successful and well-run operations in the territory. Thomas took over more and more responsibilities as he grew into a capable young man, showing his father's natural gift for ranching. William discovered a talent for horse training and began building a reputation that brought buyers from as far away as Texas. Grace proved to have her mother's head for figures and kept the ranch's accounts with meticulous precision. Frank and Clara aged together gracefully, their love maturing into something even deeper and more profound than those early passionate years. They knew each other completely now, could communicate with a glance, finish each other's sentences, anticipate needs before they were spoken. They had weathered storms, both literal and figurative, had celebrated triumphs and mourned losses, and through it all, their partnership had remained unshakable. On their 20th anniversary, the family threw them a celebration that brought neighbors from miles around. The party lasted late into the night, with music and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. Clara stood in the midst of it all, watching Frank laugh with old friends, watching their children move through the crowd with easy confidence, and felt such overwhelming gratitude that it brought tears to her eyes. Sarah, her friend from the general store, now graying and grandmother herself, appeared at Clara's elbow with 2 glasses of punch. "Happy anniversary, dear. 20 years, that is quite an accomplishment." "It does not feel like 20 years, Clara said honestly. "It feels like no time at all and also like forever, if that makes sense." "Perfect sense," Sarah agreed. "That is what a good marriage feels like. My Henry and I just celebrated our 30th and I feel the same way." Clara smiled at the mention of Henry, Sarah's husband, and coincidentally sharing a name with the man Clara had almost married. That Henry Colton had indeed married his bride from Tucson, and they had moved away from Tombstone some years ago. Clara occasionally wondered how his life had turned out but felt no regret about the choice she had made. As if sensing her thoughts, Frank appeared at her side and slipped his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "About how lucky I am," Clara said simply. "About how a burning barn and a cowboy with kind eyes changed everything." "I was the lucky one," Frank insisted. "I saw you that night, stood on your face and fear in your eyes, and somehow I just knew, this is her, this is the woman I have been waiting for. You barely knew me." "I knew enough," Frank said. "And I have spent 20 years learning the rest, and I fall more in love with you every single day." Clara turned in his arms and kissed him, not caring that they were in the middle of a party that people were watching. Some things were more important than propriety. Some loves demanded to be celebrated. The music started up again, and Frank led Clara onto the makeshift dance floor they had set up in the yard. They swayed together under the stars, and Clara rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the solid strength of his body against hers. This man had saved her life in more ways than one. He had given her safety and security, yes, but more than that, he had given her love and purpose and a place to belong. As they danced, Clara caught sight of Thomas dancing with a girl from a neighboring ranch, looking at her with an expression that was achingly familiar. William was demonstrating a rope trick for a group of admiring young people, showing off in the way young men do. Grace was sitting on the porch with an older woman, listening intently to some story, her face bright with interest. Their children were growing up, finding their own paths, but they would always have the foundation Frank and Clara had built for them of love and security, and the knowledge that family was everything. The party wound down eventually, and the guests departed, leaving behind a mess that could wait until morning. Frank and Clara stood in the yard, watching the last wagon disappear down the road and then turned to survey their home. "Come with me," Frank said suddenly, taking Clara's hand. "I want to show you something." He led her to the new barn they had built 5 years ago, much larger and sturdier than anything on the property before. Inside, by the light of the lantern Frank lit, Clara could see the familiar sight of horses in their stalls, hay bales stacked neatly, tools hung in their proper places. Everything organized and cared for the way Frank did everything. "Remember the barn that burned?" Frank asked. "The one where we met, of course. How could I forget? I used to think it was a tragedy, that fire, such destruction, such loss, but over the years I have come to see it differently." Frank set down the lantern and turned to face Clara, taking both her hands in his. "That fire brought you to me. It destroyed one future but made another one possible. And I would not change a single thing about that night, not one single detail, because it led to this, to us, to everything we have built together." Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks, moved beyond words by his declaration. 20 years, and he could still make her cry with the depth of his love. "I made you a promise that night," Frank continued. "I wrapped you in my arms and I gave you my word that you were safe, that I would protect you. And I want to renew that promise now, 20 years later. You are safe with me, Clara. You always will be. For the rest of our lives, however long that may be, I will love you and cherish you and do everything in my power to make you happy." "You have made me happy," Clara said through her tears. "Every single day you have made me happy. I love you, Frank Bennett. I love you with my whole heart." They came together in the quiet of the barn, holding each other close, and outside the stars wheeled overhead and the night wind whispered through the grass. Somewhere, cattle lowed softly, and horses moved in their stalls, and the ranch settled in for another peaceful night. Inside the house, their children were already asleep, exhausted from the celebration. Tomorrow they would all wake and resume the rhythms of ranch life, the endless cycle of work and rest, challenges and rewards. But tonight, Frank and Clara stood together in the barn and remembered where it had all started, how far they had come, and everything they had built from ashes and hope. The years ahead would bring more changes. Thomas would marry and have children of his own, eventually taking over full management of the ranch. William would establish his horse breeding operation and gain a reputation throughout the West. Grace would marry a banker from Tucson and divide her time between city life and the ranch she would always consider home. There would be grandchildren to spoil, new challenges to face, and the inevitable sorrows that come with age and loss. But through it all, Frank and Clara would remain constants for each other, their love the foundation upon which everything else was built. They would grow old together, their hair turning silver, their steps growing slower but their devotion never wavering. They would sit on the porch in their final years and watch the sun set over land they had worked and loved, and they would hold hands just as they had done from the very beginning. And when people asked Clara about how she met her husband, she would smile and tell the story of the burning barn, of the cowboy who wrapped her in his arms and gave her his word, of the choice she made to trust love over security. She would tell it as a love story, which is what it was, from the very first moment to the very last. The Bennett Ranch would remain in the family for generations, a testament to what Frank and Clara had built together. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would walk the same land, tend the same herds, and live in the house that had sheltered so much love. And they would tell the story of how it all began, with a fire and a cowboy and a brave woman who chose love when it would have been easier to choose safety. But that was all in the future. For now, in this perfect moment, Frank and Clara stood in the barn and held each other close, grateful beyond measure for the journey that had brought them together. A mail-order bride fleeing a burning barn, caught by a cowboy who wrapped her in his arms and his word. And together, they had built something that would outlast them, both a legacy of love and family and the courage to choose the difficult path when it led to something true. The lantern flickered in the quiet barn, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and outside the Arizona night stretched vast and beautiful above Bennett Ranch. Home, love, family. Everything that mattered, all of it born from a moment of crisis and transformed into a lifetime of joy. Clara had come to Arizona expecting one future and found something infinitely better. She had discovered that sometimes the universe has different plans, better plans, and that the courage to embrace those plans, even when they are terrifying and uncertain, can lead to happiness beyond imagination. As they finally left the barn and walked back to the house, hand in hand as always, Clara looked up at the stars and sent a silent thank you to whatever forces had brought her to this place, to this man, to this life. Then she followed Frank inside, closing the door behind them, ready for whatever adventures tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that they would face them together, as they had faced everything for the past 20 years and would continue to face everything for all the years to come. The story of Frank and Clara Bennett was one of love conquering fear, of trust rewarded, of promises kept. It was a story of a burning barn and a cowboy with kind eyes and a woman brave enough to choose her heart over her head. And it was a story with the best possible ending, two people who found each other against all odds and built a life together that was richer and fuller and more joyful than either could have imagined. In the house, the children slept peacefully in their beds, the ranch animals settled for the night, and the land stretched away in all directions, solid and enduring. Frank and Clara climbed the stairs to their bedroom, still holding hands, still as connected as they had been that very first night when he had pulled her from the flames and promised her safety. They prepared for bed in the comfortable silence of long marriage, moving around each other with practiced ease. When they finally lay down together, Frank pulled Clara close against him, her back to his chest, his arm around her waist, their fingers intertwined. "Thank you," Clara whispered into the darkness. "For what? For 20 years, for everything, for being you." "Thank you for saying yes," Frank replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "For staying when you could have left, for building this life with me." "I would do it again in a heartbeat," Clara said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "So would I," Frank agreed. "Every single day I would choose you." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, two people who had found their perfect match in the most imperfect of circumstances. And in the morning, they would wake and begin another day, another chapter in their ongoing story, secure in the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together. The burning barn was long gone, consumed by flames and time and transformation. But what it had created, the love between Frank and Clara Bennett, would endure for a lifetime and beyond, a testament to the power of courage and kindness, and the willingness to take a chance on love when it appears in the most unexpected of forms. This was their happily ever after, hard-won and deeply cherished, built on the foundation of that single moment when a cowboy wrapped a frightened bride in his arms and gave her his word. Everything that followed the ranch, the children, the decades of love and partnership, was simply the fulfillment of that initial promise, made in the glow of a burning barn on a warm Arizona night. And as the years stretched on and their story became part of Bennett family legend, one thing remained constant and true. Frank Bennett had promised Clara safety and love, and he had kept that promise every single day of their lives together. His word, given freely in a moment of crisis, had become the cornerstone of something beautiful and lasting and entirely real. Their love story, which began in fire and fear, had transformed into something that warmed and illuminated everything it touched. And that, in the end, was the best possible magic, not fairy tale perfection, but something far better. Real love built day by day, choice by choice, promise by promise, until it became something unshakable and eternal. Frank and Clara Bennett had found their forever in each other, and that forever lasted a lifetime, rich and full and exactly right. The burning barn had been a beginning, not an ending, and what grew from those ashes was a love story worthy of the ages, simple, profound, and absolutely true.